Hello, and a very warm welcome back to everybody. My name is Julius Sen, and I will be chairing this second session on conduct, regulation, and technology. I'm delighted that we have two very, very strong presenters who have agreed to share their thoughts and ideas. I would request participants to look at program notes for their detailed biographies. So I will just introduce them very briefly and leave as much space and time for them to present and for us to consider questions. Two presenters are Dr. Peter Andrews, who is a senior consultant at Oxera and indeed also an associate at the Systemic Risk Center, and Dr. Ajit Balakrishnan, who is an entrepreneur and a commentator. Our session today on conduct, regulation, and technology will be divided by the speakers into two topics. Dr. Peter Andrews will be talking about clear and measurable tools for enhancing regulatory accountability, while Dr. Ajit Balakrishnan will be talking about the coming algorithmic financial regulatory era. So if I may, I'll immediately switch to offer the floor to Dr. Peter Andrews to talk for half an hour initially about clear and measurable tools for enhancing regulatory accountability, with 15 minutes of questions at the end. Just to remind participants, please put your questions, the audience, please put your questions into the Q&A box if you're the audience, and if you're a panelist, please put your questions into the chat box. Dr. Peter Andrews, the floor is yours.
Well, Julius, thank you very much. I just need to share my screen, so please bear with me while I select the right image. Okay. Right, well, I hope that the correct image is now on screen. So I'm going to talk about metrics, which is, in some senses, seems like a very boring topic, but on the other hand, they are in fact incredibly important for incentivizing regulators to do the right thing and to check whether the things that were actually done were indeed the right thing or whether they need to be improved. So here we go. I'll be talking about why metrics matter. I will be talking about the British experience, which is very extensive. One of the good things about British regulation is that people aren't scared to do experiments. They try all sorts of different things. Whether we know which of them were good and which were bad is another matter, but I'll come to that. Then I'll be talking a little bit about the FCA's current initiatives on metrics, because in fact, the FCA has decided recently that this is an important matter and it's doing various things. And then I will be giving my views about how to measure conduct regulation, where I admit that there are some technical difficulties, but that those, I would argue that those are not so compelling as to mean that we shouldn't at least try to improve the measurement. So metrics matter. They can incentivize regulators to focus on the right things. And in particular, I mean by that on market failures, because one of the things that struck me from my involvement in regulation is that market failure is the rationale for regulating, and yet there hasn't been systematic measurement of the symptoms of market failure. And that means that we don't really know whether the market failures that the regulatory expensive regulatory mechanisms are addressing, whether those failures are reducing or whether they're increasing. So that's the most fundamental point. Of course, the metrics tell regulators what interventions work and what doesn't work. Collectively, they can actually be a strategic guide, because if you know across a range of metrics what is going well and what is not, can help you to decide about strategic choices, enforcement-led, an aggressive policing stance, which has come into and out of fashion several times in the UK. Reliance on private sector governance. Again, it's been fashionable sometimes and other times not so. Empowering consumers, that's also been a strategy that has had light of day for a considerable period and then been maybe scaled back a bit. Also, the metrics enable regulators to show whether they're doing well or whether they're doing badly. And I'm going to try to demonstrate that with an example from cricket, which really struck home with me when I read these statistics. So apologies for people who don't know about cricket, but I was just amazed by this statistic. Here we go. Right. So the case of cricket, again, seen as broadly fair and credible until, well, so there's been roughly 40,000 international 5-day matches, aka test matches, and these gave scope for up to 800,000 dismissals. Most dismissals are objective facts. You can see with your own eyes that wickets have been broken, for example, but there's one category of dismissal, the leg before wicket, LBW, which was historically determined entirely at the discretion of the on-field supervisor of rules, that is the umpire. And across all dismissals in test matches, the average proportion of LBW has been about 0.15. In England's 7-match series against Australia in 1970-71, the expected number of LBW awards from the Australian umpires to England and against Australia was therefore 21. But the true number awarded over the 35 days of combat was a brilliant 0. So, what was going on? Well, clearly, one couldn't be confident in the administration of the regulation by the supervisors, that is the umpires in this case, because this was a statistical abnormality of an extreme nature. And actually, there were two things going on. I mean, one was the evident bias of the supervisors. But the other one, actually, to be fair to them, was the technical difficulty faced by supervisors in implementing the rules. And this is so like regulation, financial regulation, I mean. So it meant that appointing genuinely independent supervisors was not the best solution. And in fact, the best solution, as it turned out, was the introduction of new technology when it became available. And the thing about this technology was that it validated or replaced malleable and behavioral opinions, which you might call regulatory judgment, with scientific facts. And this is exactly what clever use of new data and new analytical techniques can do for financial conduct regulation. And I suspect, although I haven't seen what he's going to say, that the next speaker is going to talk a lot more about that, and I will only touch on it briefly for that reason. And of course, if there can be more objective regulation, this will be more credible, it will be more independent. Other reasons why you might think the status quo needs to change? I think that the status quo makes the markets look less attractive than they really are. In well-functioning markets, prices impound information, financial crime is low, consumer detriment is limited. But the current metrics actually don't tell us much about the status of any of these critical things. And in a way, I regard the status quo as a bit like a game of football in which the crowd and the regulator cannot see the goalposts, that is, what's going on with market failure, and therefore doesn't know how often the regulator scores great goals. I actually think that because the occasional financial market disasters are so salient, the situation could be that you've got some regulators who are literally like World Cup winners of football, but all the crowd can see is the occasional disaster and think that they're useless. And of course, if we could have prompt and meaningful metrics about market functioning, this would rather transform the gloomy situation I just described. Because the regulator could be praised when praise is due, that would boost confidence in markets and mean that firms of all sizes will offer securities and investors come forward to buy them. And that's, after all, what the market is for. It's there to, the financial market in this sense, there to serve the real economy. And you need to attract people into it. And that means you need to have a high level of confidence. A more confident regulator would be less inclined to regulate defensively, which I think leads to over-regulation. I think early warnings could be identified and acted upon, because that's, again, been one of the problems, especially in retail consumer protection, where some new product is seen as a norm, it's seen as fashionable, there's a buzz around it. But then when people think about it, they realize that the outcomes of it are actually quite negative, but nobody realizes until millions of them have been sold. And And of course, also, if you're not confident about the regulator having complete governance on its own account, credible metrics can be used by a scrutiny body to reinforce what works and challenge appropriately where markets aren't working. So the next section. So this is the history lesson from the UK experience, where, as I say, I think we're very brave in doing experiments. And in fact, when I used to be on an IOSCO committee, the other countries often said, well, it's great that you're willing to try this, because we're not, but we will certainly learn from what you do. Well, some of the experiments actually didn't teach us very much, but anyway, let's have a quick look. So this is the kind of top level of adjustment that we can discuss. So this is starting with the Prevention of Fraud Investment Act in 1939. It's making the point that there are both common law and contractual protections for people in financial markets, and that the stock exchange has actually had a rule book since 1812. And so there's been a whole raft of things that have been there to look after participants in markets. But of course, from time to time, it's been determined that they weren't good enough. And so in 1958, there was an update of the Prevention of Frauds Investment Act. And at this point, it was felt that a very simple regime would work, given the other legal protections already there. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, we had what you might call an element of self-regulation through NISM. We had stock exchange rules, which strangely, well, perhaps not strangely, were in significant part anti-competitive. And then in the 1980s, we had the Thatcherite government with strong views about competition and making markets work. So, of course, they wanted to deregulate in one sense, which they did by removing the competitive restrictions which had been in the stock exchange. But they also did something else, which was they dressed something up as self-regulating organizations, which in reality was largely a statutory framework. And so although there were people within the individual regulatory bodies that were from the industry background, in reality, they were using statutory powers. And it was very complex. This was a really big change. I mean, suddenly we'd gone from a fairly simple world into an incredibly complex world with multiple interlocking regulators and layers of regulation between the government, the oversight body, the Securities and Investments Board, and then the individual self-regulating organizations. That lasted for around 14 years, and then we had the Financial Services and Markets Act, which legally in some ways was even more complex, but actually simplified the regulatory structure to a single peak, with banking regulation, securities regulation, consumer protection, insurance, all in the same place. And the practical approach there was based on market failure, risk analysis, and the kind of auditing model of supervision of firms, which was, ironically enough, brought in from the audit firm Arthur Andersen, which soon collapsed under the weight of its own incompetence or fraudulent conduct in terms of conducting audits. But anyway, that was what it was used. And then it was decided that this single peak wasn't the right thing, so we moved to a twin peak structure. The legislation becomes even more complex as another layer is put on top of it. And this time the practical approach is a little bit different. We've got a lot of behavioral economics. We have consumer-led policies. We have some policing and enforcement, actually. Then there was a shift away from the sort of a confrontational approach to business model analysis. If we understand the business model of the firms, we'll be able to work with them and get the right outcomes. And then we learned again in 2021 that actually the FCA is very interested in a tough policing approach, which is going back to many earlier approaches. So that's the sort of big level picture of what we've done. And unfortunately, none of those structures prevented horrible events in markets on a very grand scale. I won't actually go through them one by one, but just suffice to say that every decade we seem to have some terrible events which literally cost billions, or at least involve transfers of billions, and create a lot of public sentiment against regulation. And essentially, this is what I call the regulatory cycle. So it's regulatory reform, a bad event occurs, an inquiry starts. The person doing the inquiry, who is never an expert regulator, always decides they could do the job better than whoever was in place. And the regulators says that they were asleep on the job, despite the fact that I can personally attest to the fact that some of the people managing the regulators were really excellent individuals. Then there's regulatory reform, and then there's higher costs. And this is a terrible cycle. And we now, in the UK, have a very, very complex situation. So I'd like to point out that the UK in general is a place where there's a strong rule of law, there's a non-trivial compliance culture, which is not just about queuing. But despite all that, we still ended up with a very costly and elaborate regulatory apparatus. We still had a sequence of very bad events in the markets. And we don't know which of those regimes was better at stopping those events, if any. Direct and indirect costs are huge, as I've said. And one of the things that you really have to take away, I think, is that consumers really are very behavioral. I think the behavioral economics insights that we had about some of the consumer behavior were really powerful. And people, given all sorts of guidance from advisors, disclosures, suitability rules, and so on, will still buy terrible things in vast numbers. So the third part of my talk is, as I said, encouragingly, the FCA is now quite focused on metrics, and I think this is great. And I just want to say a few things about what they're doing, because I think some of it's very good, and some of it maybe needs a bit more thinking. So very positive initiatives. The FCA chairman, May 2021, made this, I think, very important quote, which was, by defining the right outcomes, measuring them even more, and acting on the results even faster with an enhanced data capacity, we will be able to target our interventions more effectively. Absolutely right. And being transparent about outcomes drives us to act and increases our accountability. And right again. And what I'm saying about accountability, let me just say it again and again, is I think it's really important, not because we shouldn't trust the regulator, but because accountability is actually the way that the regulator gets to be believed and to be credible. And that's very good for the markets and very good for serving the real economy. The FCA's annual plan for 2021-2022 includes these important new emphases: measurement, accountability, detection of fraud, and it continues to build on various important themes that don't need to bother us here. But in the plan, it does set out a number of metrics. One is actually, I suppose, quite strange in a way. So they say that there's this perennial top-line outcomes and metrics, including the sum of benefits, that are really, really important. And of course, the sum of benefits really is very important, but they don't, in that plan, define them, which is disappointing, but I'm sure they're working very hard on it. And then there's a lower level of metrics, which I put here: sum of consumer benefits, market cleanliness, rejecting authorization requests, reduced claims on the compensation scheme, permissions removed, that is preventing firms doing things they're not competent to do, more use by consumers of Scan, Smart and helplines, and a point about diversity, which is, I think, de rigueur for all public bodies in the UK and probably most private corporations as well, but needn't detain us here. So some observations about these metrics. So, I mean, if the top line metrics are really going to be strategic and a guiding light for what the regulator does, should they be set by the regulator or an oversight body? I think that's an interesting question, because on the one hand, you want an independent regulator. On the other hand, you want to make sure that the independence is used in a pro-social way, that the democracy, if you like, as represented by the government and the civil service departments, actually thinks is the right thing. So I think there's a question about who should be setting these. Obviously, these are very important because they will determine whether we can avoid the repeat regulatory cycle that I've already described. The relationship between these top-line metrics and the 7 overarching metrics which were disclosed obviously needs to be very clear, and I to be honest, I wasn't entirely clear how that would work. And the FCA made the point that measuring benefits is hard. I completely agree, and we'll come on to that later. And I would say that because markets are complex and the overall outcomes matter, you probably actually need a suite of metrics about each market. In terms of what the FCA has actually said, and I do have a few observations. So the first one is that the wholesale market cleanliness metric does need to be supplemented by other wholesale metrics, and I'll be coming on to that later as well. The the compensation scheme and helpline usages might or might not indicate changes in the level of fraud. They might or might not indicate changes in the level of consumer awareness, and neither is solely attributable to the regulator. So I'm a little skeptical about how valuable that is as a performance metric of the regulator. Rejected authorization requests and permissions are actually activity measures rather than outcome measures. They may be useful as compliance incentives, in fact, I'm pretty sure they are, but you don't really know whether they're a cost or a benefit because you don't know what the incidence of false positives might be. Nor can one know from this the value of mis-selling stock relative to the cost of innovation lost. And certainly in the innovation space, there's a number of reasons for thinking that British regulation is damaging investment in new technologies and venture capital, but that's beyond our scope today, but it's, I think, a very important area. And then the final metric, the sum of consumer benefits, bears directly on the FCA's strategic objective of ensuring that the relevant markets function well, if it can be estimated realistically, ideally with causal identification. And this is the metric that really matters for market confidence, regime stability, and knowing what works. So in my final section, I will be giving some views about how one might go about measuring conduct regulation. So I'll start off with some general points. In the UK, we're very lucky. We have this What Works initiative, which is backed by the government and various academic institutions, including the LSE. And a lot of thinking has been done about how you decide what works. And anyway, I've just given the link there. It's not my place to describe their work, but I do think it's very, very helpful. For regulation, I think we need a robust counterfactual. We need to know credible metrics that show the difference between what actually happened and what would have happened if the regulator hadn't done whatever the regulator did. And it's so important, because otherwise you're just observing potentially societal or economic changes rather than the effect of regulation, and that's what we need to know. And of course, because of that, ideally, we want methods of causal identification to be deployed. Now, I'm not one of these people who gets sort of overexcited about the language causal identification, because I do remember philosophy lessons, and I know that these are not objective truths. These are just statistical regularities in a context which makes it, which is suggestive of a causal relationship. That's all they are, but still very important. I think, in view of the time, I'm not going to go into those methods. On the last one, there's a very interesting IMF paper which purports to determine whether black and grey listing by FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, actually has any material effects on flows in the countries affected by the listings. It's a very neat methodology. The implementation in the IMF paper is maybe not ideal, but it's certainly a very interesting example of what seems to be an insoluble problem in terms of determining the effect of a listing, actually being unpicked a little bit. So I think that's quite impressive. Luckily, my employer, Auxera, has a very nice article on some of these methods of causal identification, which I recommend. And the final general point I'd make is you really want your metrics to be underpinned by rigorous research. You don't want just coming up with random metrics. You actually want to do some proper research work and develop the metrics out of that. Get the data, and then 3 areas. So restorative justice. Some simple metrics here, which are about how much people's money do they get back, relative to the cost of returning it. Wholesale markets, you can exploit the trade data, which is great because often they have very, very exact timestamps. And then measuring consumer protection is a little harder because you need to know data about what people bought, ideally what their portfolio was, what their circumstances were, what their goals were. This is all actually a lot harder. But it depends, I mean, if your regulations require the circumstances of, say, death execution to be recorded, it will help. Wholesale metrics, I think this is relatively straightforward. So the FCA had this market cleanliness statistic. It's an example of the combined event study difference and difference methodology. It requires precise information on the timing and content of regulatory announcements and the prices of announcement stocks and similar stocks. There's plenty of documentation of that. The paper there by a guy who did a lot of work on it in the FCA and then went off to the IMF. It's a nice paper, definitely worth reading. But beyond that, actually, in Australia, the Capital Markets Cooperative Research Centre has developed an enormous number of metrics for wholesale markets. Some of them it still markets itself through its markets quality dashboard, and some of them through its smart system are now sold through NASDAQ. But they are definitely worth looking at. And my view would be, they've invented all these. It's all underpinned by rigorous research in one of Australia's best universities. So why bother to invent your own? Just my view. Turning to retail, it's a more difficult area. Ideally, you'd be doing full suitability analysis at the household portfolio level. It's very difficult. But I also think that this strictly dominated purchases ratio is very interesting. It's what percent, and it's more tractable. So what percentage of people buy a product or enter a trade which has zero advantages over a cheap or rival product or trade? And the FCA has done that with a very good database that it has from the mortgage market, and also very good methodologies deployed in this paper, which I think may be the kind of things that the next speaker will be talking about. Anyway, I put the paper reference there. This is a really powerful thing, because although it understates the problem in the sense that the only transactions that count as negative transactions in a strictly dominated analysis are the ones that were clearly dominated in all dimensions, and there will be other ones that were dominated in some dimensions that don't count as bad in this context, but which actually weren't that. Although it's a flaw or a detriment, monitoring changes in the flaw over time or in different markets is actually a very powerful piece of information and tells you about what your regulation is doing. But of course, we need further metrics, and a time series of these strictly dominated would be great. If you do it across markets, you can effectively have an ex post VA of regulation as a whole. Clearly, you need to supplement it with cost data. But doing this in a time series over different markets would be very powerful. In the cross section, these are also powerful metrics, because you can actually look within the strictly dominated data set about which firms are generating the bad outcomes and which firms are not generating dominated outcomes. So that's very powerful as well. And of course, if you do this for long enough, or if you chunk up your organization in different ways with different strategies being followed, you can use this to see which strategies appear to be more successful than others. I also, I know quite a few people working in tech companies, and I'm so impressed by the way that those companies use quick-fire tech field trials through their websites to learn about consumer responses to different things, or what is popular or what is not, and so on. And I think this would be a very good way of exploring the consumer journey for regulators as well. Price quality changes, well, I mean, clearly this is very important for the FCA because it has a competition objective. But the price quality relationship does matter a lot, obviously, in terms of how much benefit the consumer is getting from transactions. And I've been very impressed by some work in the US using automated techniques to explore contracts and discover how they are changing online. And mostly, unfortunately, the changes were against the consumer as they became more and more complex, and consumers, rather than having to have the contracts explained to them, merely ticked a box, having on average, I think, read the contract for less than 1 second. So you can imagine how that's exploited. Yeah, early warnings. So one of the visions when of some of the regulation reforms of the late 80s was to have an early warning system nip problems in the bud. And I think that if one can be using big data and automated routines, such as the Federal Reserve's econometric model for supervision, you can very quickly see when things are turning bad. And that isn't being done, so far as I know, in regulation. But if it were done, I think it would stop some of these huge catastrophic events from unfolding. So I think India, obviously I'm no expert on what's going on in India, but it seemed to me looking at it that actually the fact there's many different stock exchanges and the fact that there are different states, geographical units within the country as a whole, may actually provide scope for effective deployment of causal identification techniques. I mean, effectively, that's what happens in the US. You know, they say, well, something was rolled out in Georgia in this year, but then 3 years later it was rolled out in Florida. What happened to those two economies in these different time periods? And I think in India you can do that, and that should be very powerful. And I'll give a couple of examples here, again based on sort of what I'm familiar with of Zero, which I think is highly valid. So one is, what are the issues around small firms scaling up through public offerings of securities? It's something we thought about a lot in the context of the European Commission. But in India, presumably, you could either by state or by exchange make things easier for small firms and see whether it makes any difference or not relative to the other states. So that's one. And then another one is if you think that a problem with these markets is that they're seen as being insufficiently ethical, then what do you do about it? And again, you can make experiments in different exchanges in different states, and it's something that, again, Zero has done a lot of work on, because ethical approaches to business may solve some things that black letter laws cannot. And so just some final thoughts. I mean, so to do some of the things I've said, it's possible that you need some legislative changes. So, for example, in the UK, we struggled a lot with field trials because there were legal concerns about whether, if we did field trials and the people in the non-treatment group were disadvantaged, that they would then have some legal rights against us. So you may want an indemnity for field trials. You might want to have some mandatory metrics to actually, frankly, to gather the resources to do the measurements, because so often when you've got tight regulatory budgets, you have to do the things you have to do, and if you don't have to do them, then they tend to get a little bit neglected. So you might want some mandatory metrics. You might need power if you want to do field trials with consumers. You might need powers to do it, and again, that could be a legislative change. And if you want to avoid periodic disasters and you can't make proper measurements for one reason or another, then maybe think about product standards, because at least then you'll know that what the consumer is getting are basically okay, and that disasters should not eventuate. So those are my slides, and I am now very happy to answer questions if I can.
Thank you very much, Peter. I really appreciate it, and perfect timing. I have two questions in the queue, which, if I may read out for everyone. The first is from Dr. Kevin James, who was the previous speaker. Given that regulators need good metrics to know if the regulatory system is working, and that good metrics is hard because products vary along so many dimensions, is there a case for imposing more product standardization?
Right, well, he evidently anticipated my final remark, because of course I'm saying that when it is very hard to measure, yes, maybe you do need to have minimum standards. I mean, the argument against it, which has had some weight in the UK, is that it may be to the detriment of competition and innovation, and so that is not something that I would lightly dismiss. I would say, though, that the amount of genuine innovation in retail financial services seems to be quite limited. If great innovation happens, you can always borrow it from whatever country it was invented in. You know, I mean, I think the cash machine is great, but I think it was invented in Australia, and then we all copied it. So you don't really need to make yourself a victim by by allowing a lot of innovation to occur that may turn out to be not very helpful. Because as I say, you can just exploit other people's. So I think that, and also given the enormous importance of finance to the well-being of families, I'm not sure. As a public policy generalist, I would want a lot of experimentation to be going on in case it turns out the experiment is a bad one, and people are in poverty when they retire or in other difficulties. So I think there's much to be said for safe products.
Thank you, Peter. Second question is from David Llewellyn. Thank you very much for a comprehensive presentation. Could you outline what research has been done by the FCA on the costs of regulation in total? Cost-benefit analysis applied to each specific regulation may suggest that the benefits exceed the costs, and yet an analysis of the totality of all regulations might suggest a different conclusion. The total of all costs may exceed the sum of the parts.
Well, it's great to hear from David, who gave tremendous advice to the regulators at different times in their evolution. And I completely agree with him. In fact, I was thinking of one such example when I was talking, which is the following. Insurance companies were deemed to some extent by the Bank of England to be systemic. And as a result of that, a capital regime which broadly resembles the capital regime for banks was introduced for them. It must be said, though, that the case that they are systemic was not entirely clear-cut or convincing. But anyway, the effect of Solvency II, which is the European-wide initiative, was that a lot of equities were taken out of the balance sheets of insurance companies. At the same time, the pensions regulator, worried about some pension scandals, was ratcheting up pressure on pension fund trustees not to take risks. And as a result of that, the enormous amounts of pension fund assets are actually in gilts or corporate bonds, and very little of it in equity. And then at the same time, consumer protection regulators worried about people overpaying for financial products and having much of their wealth or much of their return at least transferred to the intermediaries, were making rules about fee caps and so on, which meant that the kind of expensive advice you need to discriminate between different venture capital opportunities was not something that a lot of people were in a position to pay for. So if you put those three things together, what you actually have in the UK now is a situation in which literally scores of billions of capital are not productive. They are just invested in low-yielding corporate bonds and gilts, and the sunrise technologies that could power the fourth industrial revolution are starved of risk capital. It's a terrible situation, and I think it's a great example of what David is talking about.
Thank you, Peter. The next question is from Dr. Shanmugam, who is the chair of the last session. Can you indicate a field trial-based decision taken by the regulatory authority and explain the same?
Okay, so I need to rack my memory here. Yes, so I think it's true to say that many of the trials that were undertaken in the FCA were actually had strong elements of laboratory, but a very simple one, but a very simple one which was a field trial, concerned the claiming of foregone redress. So the supervisors of various firms identified that when redress was due to consumers from those firms at the behest of the regulator, the firms would write to the consumers and hear nothing back, even though the letters were actually saying, respond to this letter with your bank details and we will pay you several £1,000s. Now, clearly, that is a behavioural situation, because it's completely not what you think Homo economicus would be doing. And of course, the reality must be, given that people don't change addresses so often, that this enormous sample of people would not be able to be contacted. The reality must be that they were seeing letters from these boring financial companies and either throwing them straight into the bin or reading the first line, not understanding it, and throwing it into the bin. So various trials were done, which experimented with different forms of letter that would actually attract the attention of the reader so that they would do what the letter said, i.e. claim the money that was due to them. And that had some success.
Thank you, Peter. Now, the last question is actually a series of observations which embody a question from Dr. Madhusudan Sahu, who will be a panelist in a subsequent session. So I'll just read it out, and if you could respond. Metrics for performance of the regulator and metrics for performance of the regulated market need to be different. Elliot Eisner, quote, "Not everything that matters can be measured, or not everything can be measured not everything that can be measured matters. It is difficult for metrics to capture the matters that cannot be measured, even if they matter. Goodhart's law: when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. This makes the metric susceptible to manipulation. The recent example is ease of doing business metrics of the World Bank." So you can see within that there are several questions.
Yes. No, a marvelous observation. Yes. Well, I mean, the first thing is, I'm not pretending that it's easy to measure the sorts of things that we care about here, or that there won't be some perverse effects of measures. I think both of those things are likely to be true. My starting point is that at the moment, the lack of metrics is having terrible effects, because the regulators, when something goes wrong, have no defense at all. They can't say, we brought about this benefit, this benefit, this benefit, which cumulatively have an enormous value. They can't say it because they don't know. They don't have any credible metrics at all. And so, as I was explaining in my regulatory cycle slide, they are held up as being fools who were asleep on the job, dozy, incompetent, you name it, not knowing how to regulate. And that needs to stop. And the only way it can stop is with some credible metrics. Now, I agree that along the way, that there will be some unfortunate side effects. But that shouldn't, I think, distract us from the bigger goal, which is to try to make an improvement. The argument is really a little bit similar to the ones about the impossibility of CBA. Yes, I mean, in some sense, a perfect CBA is impossible, but it doesn't mean that trying to measure some things is not helpful. And I am so depressed, if you like, by the British experience over a very long period that I think we do need to try something different.
Thank you very much, Peter. We are out of time for your slot. If I may, on behalf of everyone at NISM and SRC, thank you very, very much for sharing your thoughts and ideas with us. I do hope some of these conversations can continue in another forum.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.